This was a time when Israel was sinking into darkness. After the death of King Solomon, God's chosen people slowly forgot their Lord under the reign of Ahab, the worst king Israel had ever known. The blood of innocent prophets stained the Holy Land, hunted and eliminated by his cruel wife, Jezebel. Israel had forgotten the name of God, and now knelt before altars of stone and wood. But God had not abandoned his people. Deep in the mountains of Gilead, God was preparing a response. In that arid, forgotten land, a man was hidden who would change history forever. Elijah. This is the story of the most powerful prophet, the one who commanded the heavens to close and never tasted death. But it is also the story of the man behind the prophet, his fears, his doubts, and his loneliness. Because Elijah was human, and his greatest battle was not against kings or armies, but against himself, against his doubts and the solitude that consumed him from within until it broke him. For many years, Elijah had lived in silence, hidden among the arid mountain. He was not a warrior or a priest. He wore a camel hair tunic. A thick beard covered his face, and his eyes burned with a supernatural intensity. Until one day, God revealed his calling. The time of waiting was over. Elijah rose, descended from the mountains, and headed directly for the heart of the corruption, Samaria, the kingdom's capital, where Ahab reigned alongside Jezebel. The soldiers at the palace gates, seeing him pass, were paralyzed by an invisible force and let him through as if the very air parted for him. Elijah walked through the corridors of the throne room without announcement or escort. The palace columns, which had seen so many bow before kings and ambassadors, now seemed to witness something different. A wild prophet without a crown or a sword, walking as if God himself propelled him forward. And there sat Ahab on his throne, surrounded by counselors, idols, and vanity. But it was not he who spoke. Before he could ask who this stranger was, Elijah stopped in front of him and spoke the words that would seal the kingdom's fate. As the Lord, the God of Israel, lives, whom I serve, there will be neither dew nor rain in the next few years, except at my word. Silence fell like a judgment. No one dared to breathe. Elijah did not wait for a reaction. Suddenly, he turned, spun around, and disappeared the way he had come. Ahab didn't say a word, didn't order his capture, or curse him. He just stood there motionless. And then it happened. Suddenly, the clouds began to dissipate, the air grew dry, and the sky began to close like a sealed door from above. And as Elijah left, God spoke to him again, saying, "Go away from here. Turn eastward and hide yourself by the brook Cherith, east of the Jordan. You shall drink from the brook, and I have commanded the ravens to feed you there." Elijah obeyed without a thought and headed east as the earth dried up in his wake. The cool breeze stopped, and the dew that had moistened the fields of Israel each morning ceased to fall. The sun scorched the fields, and what was once a proud and fertile nation began to wither. The judgment had already begun, and for 3 long years, not a single drop of water would touch the ground. But while the kingdom was entering a drought, Elijah crossed hills and valleys until he found that hidden place, Cherith, a thread of water that cut through the land like a scar, winding between dry stones and low bushes. Elijah settled in this hidden oasis, deep in the desert, where every dawn and every dusk a miracle happened. When the sun woke up in the morning, the beating of wings could suddenly be heard in the sky. They were ravens, black-feathered birds emerging on the horizon, carrying bread and meat in their beaks. They would land near the prophet to deposit the food. They were unclean birds according to the law and despised by men, but they were the ones chosen by God to bring him food every morning and every evening. When the sun tinged the hills with its amber light, Elijah would eat in silence, drinking from the brook, watching in the deepest solitude as days turned into weeks and weeks into months. And the drought, like a silent curse, began to cast its shadow over all of Israel. Wells ran dry, fields became barren, and animals fell exhausted on the cracked earth. From his throne, Ahab gave desperate orders to find the man responsible for his ruin. But he gradually began to realize something. The stones that were once submerged emerged like islands in the riverbed, and the once vigorous current became a thin trickle. The drought he himself had prophesied was beginning to reach him, until one morning, when he bent down to drink, he found no water. The brook Cherith had dried up. But Elijah was not alarmed, nor did he complain. He just had faith and waited until the voice of God said to him, "Arise, go to Zarephath, which belongs to Sidon, and stay there. I have commanded a widow to provide for you." The Lord ordered him to go to a dangerous region, Zarephath, the very homeland of Jezebel, the queen who had sworn to exterminate all the prophets. But Elijah did not hesitate. He got up, wrapped himself in his cloak, and began to walk. The journey was very hard. The sun beat down on the cracked fields and bare trees. The drought showed no mercy. Everything that breathed seemed to bow before the judgment he himself had announced. When he arrived at the gates of Zarephath, he suddenly saw her, a fragile woman, dressed in rags, gathering dry branches with a haggard face, cracked hands, and a defeated look. Something in his spirit confirmed it. It was her. Elijah approached with a calm voice and said to her, "Please, bring me a little water in a jar so that I may drink." The woman, not knowing him, turned to obey. But before she could take another step, Elijah added, "Also bring me a piece of bread in your hand." Then she stopped, lowered her gaze, and with a broken voice replied, "As surely as the Lord your God lives, I have no bread. I only have a handful of flour in a jar and a little oil in a jug. I was gathering a couple of sticks to prepare one last meal for myself and my son." And there, in that silent scene, another deeper truth than the drought was revealed. The crisis was not just in the heavens, it was in the loss of hope. Elijah replied, "Don't be afraid. Go home and do as you have said. But first, make me a small cake of bread and bring it to me. For thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, the jar of flour will not be used up, and the jug of oil will not run dry until the day the Lord sends rain on the land." The woman looked at him in silence. She had two options: to cling to the little she had left or to let it go and trust. She could die with dignity, or she could obey and see what happened. And she chose to believe, not in Baal, or in the idols of her land, or in her own judgment. She chose to believe in the word of a stranger, a foreigner covered in dust. She went back to her house, lit the fire, poured the flour and the oil, and baked. And when she returned to the jar, the flour was still there, and the oil in the jug had not been used up. That day, the three of them ate, she, her son, and Elijah. And the next day, too. But suddenly, the widow's son fell ill. At first, it was just a fever, but then his breath grew short, and in a matter of hours, the child stopped breathing. The mother fell to her knees, broken inside. The same man who had brought life to her house now seemed to have brought death. "Did you come to remind me of my sins?" she cried out through her tears. Elijah didn't answer. He took the child in his arms, carried him to the upper room where he was staying, laid him on the bed, and cried out to heaven, "Lord, my God, have you also brought tragedy to this widow who's taken me in by killing her son?" And then he did something that no prophet had ever done before. He stretched himself out on the body of the child 3 times, as if trying to cover him with his own life, and begged desperately, "Lord, my God, I pray that you return this child's life." The silence was long, heavy, and unbearable until the child's chest rose and his breath returned. Elijah went down the stairs and gave the living child back to his mother, saying, "Look, your son lives." In that instant, the widow not only recovered her son, but she recovered her faith. "Now I know that you are a man of God," she said with tears in her eyes, "and that the word of the Lord in your mouth is true." In a pagan land, where altars were for gods of stone and fire, a true flame had been lit. For 3 years, not a single drop of rain had fallen, and God's judgment had spread like a wound over Israel. Flocks of animals disappeared, wells ran dry, and harvests became a memory. The famine first struck the poor, but it soon reached the rich. But in that desperation, not everyone had surrendered to Baal. One of them was Obadiah, a steward of King Ahab, who had seen the king's cruelty and had not stood idly by. During the persecution and massacre of God's priests and prophets, he did the unthinkable. He hid 100 of the Lord's prophets in caves, 50 in each one, and secretly fed them with bread and water. He risked his life every day for the love of his God. And he also managed to keep Ahab from finding out and continued to trust him. One morning, the king gave him an order. "Go through the country. Look for grass, springs, any brook that has not dried up. Maybe we can save the horses and mules." Obadiah left through the ruins of the kingdom, crossing dead fields, when he suddenly saw him. There, in the dust of the road, Elijah stood, tall, firm, with eyes like ancient fire. Obadiah fell to the ground and said, "Is it you, my lord, Elijah?" "It is I," the prophet replied. "Go and tell your master, Elijah is here." Obadiah stood up slowly. Fear cut off his breath, and his eyes revealed deep anguish. "What have I done that you would put my life in danger? If I go and tell Ahab that you are here, and then the Spirit of the Lord takes you to another place and he doesn't find you, he will kill me." And then he confessed his secret to Elijah. "I have served the Lord from my youth. When Jezebel was killing the prophets, I hid 100 of them in cave. I fed them myself. I have done what I could, Elijah, and now you ask this of me." But Elijah did not back down and reply, "As surely as the Lord of hosts lives." Obadiah knew he was in front of a man who spoke as if heaven was at his back, and he obeyed. He returned to the palace with a pounding heart and told the king the words no one expected to hear. "Elijah has returned." The same prophet who had closed the heaven, who had humbled the king before his throne and disappeared when they sought him most, was now back. Ahab hesitated, mounted his chariot, and set off for the appointed place. And it was Ahab who broke the silence with contempt. "Is it you, the troubler of Israel?" But Elijah looked him in the eyes and replied in a firm voice, "I am not the one who troubles Israel, but you and your father's house, for having abandoned the commandments of the Lord and following Baal." And then Elijah threw down the challenge. "Now, summon all Israel to Mount Carmel. Let the 450 prophets of Baal and the 400 prophets of Asherah, who eat at Jezebel's table, come. Today we will see who is God." And the confrontation began. News spread throughout Israel, and thousands climbed from all corners of the kingdom to Mount Carmel. Old men, young people, priests, soldiers, peasants. No one wanted to miss what was about to happen. On the summit, the air was tense. On one side were the nearly 1,000 prophets of Baal and Asherah, adorned with gaudy clothes and pagan symbols. And on the other, alone, covered by a cloak, worn by the sun and the wind, stood Elijah. The prophet raised his voice and asked the people sadly, "How long will you waver between two opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him. But if Baal is God, then follow him." The crowd fell silent. Then Elijah explained the rules of the challenge. I am the only one left as a prophet of the Lord, but Baal has 450 prophets. Bring 2 bulls. They will choose one, cut it into pieces, and place it on the wood, but without lighting a fire. I will prepare the other young bull, place it on the wood, and also not light a fire. You will call on the name of your God, and I will call on the name of the Lord, the God who answers with fire. He is God. The prophets of Baal began first. They prepared their altar, cut the bull into pieces, and placed it on the dry wood. Then the macabre spectacle began. From morning until noon, the 450 men screamed, jumped, and danced frantically around the altar. But there was no response, not even a minimal sign. Baal remained absolutely and humiliatingly silent. The sun rose to its highest point, and Elijah, looking at that tragic scene, began to mock them, ironically. Shout louder. Perhaps Baal is busy or has gone away. Then, desperate, they shouted with wild desperation, intensifying the macabre spectacle, cutting themselves until they bled. The afternoon fell slowly over Mount Carmel, but there was no response. No fire descended. The crowd began to murmur, and Baal's impotence was exposed to all the Israelites. It was Elijah's turn. The tired and disillusioned crowd gathered in a circle around him. In silence, he took 12 stones, one for each tribe of Israel, and rebuilt the broken altar of the Lord. He carefully placed the wood and on it the sacrifice. Then he asked for something impossible in the middle of the drought. He ordered them to bring 4 jars full of water and pour it over the sacrifice. Once, twice, 3 times they did it, until the altar was completely soaked and the water filled a trench around the sacrifice. Then, in front of everyone, the prophet raised his eyes to heaven and cried out, Lord, God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, show them today that you are God in Israel, and that I am your servant, and that I have done all this by your word. Answer me, Lord, answer me, so that this people may know that you alone are God. The silence after the prayer was brief but profound, and suddenly, a scorching fire descended from heaven, a living flame that consumed in an instant the sacrifice, the wood, the stones, and the water, leaving only dust and a reverent silence. The people fell to their knees, recognizing the true God, crying out in fear, The Lord is God! The Lord is God! At that moment, there was no doubt. Yahweh had answered, not Baal. Elijah's spiritual authority was clearly established, and the crowd clearly understood that the drought was a direct result of having abandoned the Lord. The truth now shone clearer than ever on the summit of Carmel. The prophet then looked at the false prophets of Baal, whose arrogance had been reduced to ashes, and ordered them to be captured. All were taken to the brook Kishon, where the judgment that God had commanded since ancient times was executed. The execution of all those who led Israel into idolatry. And while the people contemplated that decisive moment, Elijah felt something in his spirit that he had not felt for 3 years. The distant murmur of a rain that was about to arrive, a sound that no one else could hear yet, but that the prophet knew would soon be evident to everyone. The prophet looked at King Ahab and said to him with calm and authority, Prepare your chariot and go down immediately, because the sound of a storm is already heard. Ahab looked up and saw a sky as dry and clear as it had been for the last 3 years. The drought had fulfilled its purpose, and now God was ready to open the heavens and once again pour out his mercy. Then Elijah went up to the mountain again and began to pray fervently. Determined, with the faith of one who knows the God he serves well. Next to him, his servant waited for instruction. Go up and look toward the sea. Elijah ordered him. The young man ran, looked, returned, and replied panting, There is nothing. Elijah did not move, and in a firm voice, he insisted. "Go back and look." The young man returned a second time and nothing. He returned a third, a fourth. 6 times he returned saying the same thing. But Elijah did not stop. He kept on crying out. He knew that God was not finished. On the 7th time, the young man came running back and said with surprise, "I see a small cloud rising from the sea, barely the size of a man's hand." For Elijah, that was enough. He quickly got up and, in a loud voice, ordered him, "Go and tell Ahab to hitch up his chariot and go down quickly before the rain stops him." In a few minutes, that small cloud grew. The sky quickly darkened, and a violent wind rose from the horizon. After 3 years, heavy drops fell on the dry earth. In an instant, the light drizzle turned into a torrential storm, soaking the parched ground, making new streams run through the cracked furrows of the earth. Ahab hastily mounted his chariot and began the descent to Jezreel, driven by the torrential rain that now covered everything. But then something extraordinary happened. The hand of the Lord came upon Elijah. The prophet tucked his cloak into his waistband and began to run. Not like a common man, but with the supernatural speed of one who is driven by God himself. Before the king's astonished eyes, the prophet outran the horses, running through the storm as if the force of the wind carried him. It was a powerful image. The man who had closed the heavens was now running ahead of the king, showing who truly ruled Israel. Not Ahab, not Jezebel, not Baal, but Yahweh, the living God. But this rain was more than water. It was a profound lesson. God answers those who pray with persistence. It was not on the first attempt, or the second, or even the 6th. God answered when Elijah persevered in prayer. Confident in the promise he'd received, the drought had ended, and the people received the expected mercy. But the battle was about to begin, because while water fell in abundance over Israel, an enraged woman was waiting in the palace, and Elijah would soon face the greatest test of his life. In the palace of Jezreel, Jezebel received the news. Elijah had humiliated her prophets. He had destroyed her priests. Her face twisted into a grimace of anger, and she sent a messenger to the prophet with a threat that was not just a warning, but a promise of death. "May the gods punish me if by this time tomorrow I do not make you what you did to each of them." When Elijah heard those words, his heart sank in a dark fear he had never known. The same prophet who had challenged hundreds on Mount Carmel, who had made fire descend from heaven, now trembled before the threat of an enraged woman. Without thinking, without seeking God, he fled. He ran south, leaving behind the people who were just beginning to return to God. Leaving behind his mission, he crossed fields and mountains without stopping, without looking back, like a man pursued by death itself. Finally, he reached the desert, alone and exhausted. There, under the sparse shade of a broom tree, the prophet collapsed to the ground. With tears he could no longer hold back, he cried out to heaven in bitterness, "It is enough, Lord. Take now my life, for I am no better than my fathers." Those words came from the depths of his soul. Elijah, the great prophet, had hit rock bottom. All his strength, his faith, and his courage seemed to have evaporated in the relentless desert heat. And there, under the sparse shade of the tree, he wished to close his eyes forever. It was not just Jezebel's threat that had destroyed him, but the unbearable loneliness, the burden of feeling like the only faithful one, and the disappointment that after so much effort, it seemed that nothing had changed. But there, in the depths of the desert, in the darkest moment of his life, God did not abandon him. Elijah slowly opened his tired eyes and saw next to him an angel who spoke to him with tenderness and firmness. "Get up and eat." Elijah looked around and found a baked loaf of bread on hot coals and a jug with fresh water. He ate and drank, but the weight in his heart was still too much. He fell asleep again. trying to escape his pain once more. But the angel came back again. He touched him with patience and compassion, repeating in a calm but determined voice, "Get up and eat, for you still have a long way to go." These words resonated in Elijah's exhausted heart. The prophet, who had fled in desperation, was now walking toward an even more intimate and profound encounter with God. There, on that mountain, in the same place where centuries earlier God had spoken face to face with Moses, Elijah would discover something new. Because Elijah was human, profoundly human. He had been used for great miracles. He had seen impossible things. But now he faced the most difficult reality of all, his own fragility, his humanity. And in the midst of that broken humanity, God showed him mercy. Because God's men also get tired. They also suffer. They also doubt. Under that broom tree, Elijah discovered that God not only uses strong men, but that he raises up broken men. And that in the midst of the deepest weakness, God begins his greatest works. That food gave him inexplicable strength. Elijah got up and set off for Horeb. And with that strength, he walked for 40 days and 40 nights, crossing the scorching desert until he reached Mount Horeb, the mountain of God, where he would speak with him face to face. Elijah arrived at Mount Horeb. Now, exhausted and broken, Elijah entered a dark cave, seeking refuge from the arid wind. And there, in the deep solitude of that cave, God spoke to him directly. "What are you doing here?" Elijah, the prophet, with his face still hidden by anguish, replied from the bottom of his wounded heart, "I have felt a deep zeal for you, Lord, but the Israelites have abandoned your covenant. They have destroyed your altars, and they have killed your prophets with the sword. I am the only one left alive, and now they are also seeking to kill me." Elijah's voice sounded fragile, tired, like that of a man who had fought too long alone. But God did not answer him with reproaches. Instead, he invited him to leave the cave and stand on the mountain, because the Lord was about to pass before him. Suddenly, a furious wind rose, so powerful that it split the rocks and shook the entire mountain. Elijah clung to the stone walls. But the Lord was not in that violent wind. Then came an earthquake that made the earth tremble under his feet. But the Lord was not in that earthquake either. After the earthquake, an intense fire appeared that illuminated the mountain with a burning force. But the Lord was not in the fire either. And then the calm came. An absolute silence enveloped the mountain. Something different emerged. A soft, almost inaudible whisper, like the light breeze that gently caresses the skin. Upon hearing that delicate whisper, Elijah knew that God was there. He covered his face with his cloak, slowly left the cave, and stood at the entrance. In that soft whisper was the same powerful voice that had created the universe. But now it spoke with the tenderness of a father who comforts his tired child. God asked again with infinite patience, "What are you doing here?" Elijah. The prophet repeated his complaint again, but this time in that heavenly whisper. Something inside him began to heal. God did not accuse him. He did not reject him. But he gave him a new mission. He spoke to him clearly with renewed authority. "Go back on your way. You will anoint Hazael as king over Syria, Jehu as king over Israel, and you will anoint Elijah to be prophet in your place." And then he revealed something deeper, something Elijah was completely unaware of. "I have reserved 7, in Israel, 0 who have not bowed their knees to Baal, nor kissed his idols." Upon hearing these words, the prophet's heart began to beat strongly again. He was not alone. God had preserved a faithful remnant, hidden and protected, waiting for the right moment to manifest. His ministry, his purpose, had not been in vain. Elijah descended from Mount Horeb with a restored heart and a clear mission. He was no longer the same man who had asked for death under the broom tree. Now he walked with a firm step, knowing that his time had not ended and would not end. God had only told him whom he should anoint, whom he should prepare. Among those names, one resonated with a special purpose: Elijah, son of Shaphat. And there he went to the fields where Elijah worked with his own hand. Elijah was not a priest or a prophet, he was a farmer. He was plowing the land with 12 teams of oxen, and he himself was guiding the last one. His hands were calloused from work, his tunic stained with dust, his back bent from the daily toil. Elijah approached, and without saying a word, he took off his cloak and threw it over Elijah. That gesture said it all. It was the symbol of the calling, the transfer of a divine mission, and the beginning of a new destiny. Elisha stopped. He felt the weight of the cloak on his shoulders and instantly understood what it meant. He knew that in that moment, his life had changed forever. He ran after Elijah and asked for one last gesture of humanity. "Let me kiss my father and mother, and then I will follow you." And Elijah, without emotion or pressure, replied, "Go, return. Do you not already know what I have done with you?" Then something radical happened. Elisha returned to the field, but not to stay. He took the team of oxen he was working with and sacrificed them. Then he took the plow, the wood, the tools of his trade, and set them on fire. On that improvised altar, he cooked the meat and shared it with the people of his village. He burned his past, leaving nothing to go back to. He did not keep an excuse or a safety net. He left everything and followed Elijah. And from that day on, Elisha became his servant. Years had passed since the fire on Carmel, and the people of Israel seemed to have forgotten the warning. The people had returned to their routine. And Ahab, although he had seen the power of God with his own eye, continued to rule as if nothing had changed. He was still a weak king, dominated by a ruthless woman, Jezebel. In Samaria, Ahab had everything a king could want: palaces, gardens, gold, servants. Next to his palace lived a righteous man named Naboth. His vineyard was not large or luxurious, but it was his inheritance from his parents. Ahab coveted it from the first moment. He approached Naboth with a false smile, offering him money or a better vineyard in exchange. But Naboth refused firmly. "The Lord forbid that I should give you the inheritance of my fathers." Ahab returned to his palace like a spoiled child, lay on his bed, turned his face to the wall, and refused to eat. Greed had hurt his pride, and his weakness made him bitter. Then Jezebel, seeing him depressed, asked him with disdain, "Are you the king of Israel or not? Get up, eat, and be cheerful, for I will give you the vineyard of Naboth." With cruel coldness, she wrote letters in the king's name, sealing them with his royal ring. She ordered a fast to be proclaimed and placed Naboth in a place of honor. But next to him, she sat two wicked men who falsely accused him in the middle of the assembly. "Naboth has cursed God and the king, without trial or defense." Naboth was dragged out of the city and stoned to death. His crime was defending what was his. When the news reached Jezebel, she smiled with satisfaction and said to Ahab, "Arise and take possession of the vineyard. Naboth is not alive." Ahab went to contemplate his new land like a satisfied child, believing he had won. But as he walked through the vineyards, Elijah suddenly appeared with a face hardened by judgment. The king trembled when he saw him and said, "Have you found me, my enemy?" Elijah replied without hesitation, "I have found you, because you have sold yourself to do evil in the sight of the Lord." And once again, Elijah gave him his sentence. "Thus says the Lord, in the very place where the dogs licked the blood of Naboth, they will also lick your blood. I will bring disaster upon you. I will sweep away your descendants and put an end to your lineage as I did to Jeroboam. As for Jezebel, your wife, the dog shall devour her by the wall of Jezreel. Anyone belonging to you who dies in the city will be eaten by the dogs." and anyone who dies in the field will be devoured by the birds of the sky. For the first time, Elijah's voice did not seem like that of an enemy, but that of a judge. And this time, Ahab neither blasphemed nor even called his soldiers. He tore his clothes, covered himself with sackcloth, fasted, lay down in silence, and did not eat. He walked slowly with a face bowed and weeping in heaven. God saw him and spoke to Elijah once more, because Ahab has humbled himself. I will not bring the disaster in his days, but in the days of his son, I will bring the disaster upon his house. Ahab was warned. He would pay for the idolatry and corruption he had sown throughout Israel. But years passed, and Ahab believed that God had forgotten his sentence. He decided to go to war to recover the city of Ramoth-Gilead from Syrian rule. And although a prophet warned him that he would die, Ahab ignored the voice of God. He disguised himself, believing that he could cheat fate. But a randomly launched arrow pierced his armor right at the weak point. Ahab bled in silence inside his chariot until he died in the evening. And when they washed his chariot, the dogs licked his blood, just as Elijah had prophesied. Thus died Ahab, the worst king of Israel in all its history. And his son Ahaziah took the throne. But Ahaziah was not long in following the same corrupt path his parents had set. And a few days later, Ahaziah fell from the high window of his palace in Samaria. The young king made a decision that would seal his fate. Instead of crying out to the God of Israel, he sent messengers to the Philistine city of Ekron to consult Baal-zebub, the pagan god of flies and diseases. But God saw it and said to Elijah, "Arise and go up to meet the messengers of the king of Samaria and say to them, is it because there is no God in Israel that you go to consult Baal-zebub, the god of Ekron? Therefore, thus says the Lord, you will not rise from the bed you have gotten into, but you will surely die." Elijah obeyed, and the message quickly reached the palace. Ahaziah was surprised and asked, "What kind of man was he who came up to meet you?" They replied, "He was a man covered with a hairy cloak and a leather belt around his waist." And Ahaziah knew immediately. It was Elijah the Tishbite. The king's anger was kindled, and he sent a captain with 50 men to arrest him. They found the prophet sitting on the top of a hill, and the captain shouted arrogantly, "Man of God, the king says to come down." But Elijah replied calmly, "If I am a man of God, let fire come down from heaven and consume you and your 50. And then it happened. A roar tore through the sky. A flame descended and devoured the captain and his soldiers in an instant. The screams faded, reduced to ashes. Ahaziah, stubborn in his rebellion, sent another captain with another 50. The result was the same: fire, judgment, and death. But the third captain was different. He did not come with orders or threats. He knelt down, raised his hands, and begged, "Man of God, I beg you that my life and the life of these 50 servants of yours be precious in your eyes." And this time, the voice of God spoke to Elijah. "Go down with him. Do not be afraid." The prophet got up and went down with the third captain to the palace. He presented himself with authority before Ahaziah's bed and confirmed what had already been said. "Thus says the Lord, because you sent messengers to consult Baal-zebub, as if there were no God in Israel, you will not rise from the bed where you are, but you will surely die." And so it was. Ahaziah died, and with him, another link in the house of Ahab fell under the weight of divine judgment. The death of Ahaziah marked the end of a generation. He left no son to occupy his throne, and the lineage of Ahab began to crumble like a wall cracked from within. But while judgment was being carried out in the palaces, something sacred was being brewed on the roads, because now it was Elijah who was preparing to lead, and not for death, but for eternity. Elijah knew that the end was coming. His spirit, refined by years of listening to the voice of God, felt it with absolute clarity. His time on earth had come to an end. But it would not be a silent farewell, nor would he do it alone. From Gilgal, the prophet began his last journey. Elijah got up early that morning. The desert breeze was softer than usual. The sun had not yet fully risen, and yet he embarked on his journey. At his side walked Elisha, his disciple, his heir, the young man who had left everything to follow him and who since then had not been separated from him for a single day. In each place, Elijah tested his heart. When they reached the entrance to the promised land, he said to him, "Stay here, Elisha, because the Lord has sent me to Bethel." But Elisha did not hesitate. "As surely as the Lord lives and as you yourself live, I will not leave you." And he continued walking with him. In Bethel, the sons of the prophets came out to meet them, approached Elijah, and said to him in a low voice, "Do you know that today the Lord will take your master from your side?" Elijah just nodded. "Yes, I know, be silent." And Elijah again said to him, "Stay here, because the Lord is sending me to Jericho." But the answer did not change. Elisha would not be separated. They arrived at Jericho, a city of ancient miracles and falling walls. And again the sons of the prophets came out to meet them and repeated the same warning. But Elisha, in his silent pain, responded again, "Yes, I know. Be silent." Finally, they reached the Jordan, the sacred river. It was the threshold between the human and the divine. 50 sons of the prophets watched them from afar as witnesses to a moment that would be etched in eternity. Then Elijah took his cloak, rolled it up, and struck the waters. And suddenly, the waters opened, as in the days of Moses. The current receded, and the waters opened to the right and left, leaving a dry path for the two to cross to the other side. At that moment, Elijah stopped. He knew that his journey was about to end, but he could not leave without first leaving his inheritance. He looked at Elijah and said to him, "Ask what you want me to do for you before I am taken from you," he said in a solemn voice. And Elisha, without hesitation, asked for the impossible. "I pray that a double portion of your spirit may come upon me." Elijah looked at him, knowing the audacity. "You have asked for a difficult thing. But if you see me when I am taken from you, it will be granted to you." They continued walking together in silence. As the sun began to set, when suddenly the sky opened, a whirlwind arose from the heavens. The sands swirled, the wind roared with superhuman force, and something shocking appeared. A chariot of fire with horses of fire, descending like a burning arrow from the heights. The whirlwind blew with force, and Elijah was snatched up in that whirlwind, enveloped in fire, enveloped in glory. Elisha cried out with all the pain of a son, but there was no one there. Elijah had been taken to heaven without seeing death, and his cloak fell slowly until it touched the ground. Elisha picked it up, trembling. It was a testimony, a symbol that the spirit that had worked in the prophet of fire now rested upon him. He returned to the Jordan, the same river they had crossed together before. He struck the waters with his master's cloak and cried out, "Where is the Lord, the God of Elijah?" And the Jordan opened again, and the prophets who watched from afar prostrated themselves. They no longer saw Elisha as a servant. Now the spirit of Elijah rested upon him. Elijah had ascended, but his fire had not been extinguished. It had only changed hands. And that day, at the crossing of the Jordan, the prophetic legacy continued. But although Elijah had ascended, his word had not been left behind. God had not forgotten the promise of judgment against the house of Ahab, nor the innocent blood shed in Naboth's vineyard. And now, in the days of Elisha, that word would rise with implacable power, because judgment was already on its way. And when the appointed time came, God raised up Jehu, a commander of the army of Israel, an implacable, firm, determined, and reckless warriors. The Lord spoke through the prophet Elijah and gave him clear instructions. He sent a young prophet to the military camp where Jehu was. He poured oil on his head and said, "Thus says Yahweh, the God of Israel, I anoint you king over the people of the Lord, over Israel. And you shall strike down the house of Ahab, and you shall avenge the blood of my servants, the prophets. Because all the house of Ahab shall perish, there shall not remain a male. And Jezebel shall be eaten by the dogs in Jezreel, and there will be no one to bury her." Before Jehu could say a word, the young prophet disappeared like a whisper into the shadows. Jehu came out again before his men, covered in oil with fiery eyes. His companions looked at him expectantly. "What did that man want? What did he say to you?" He initially hesitated, but then he looked into everyone's eyes and replied in a firm voice, "He anointed me king over Israel." Then everyone stood up. Each one took his cloak and placed it under Jehu's feet as a sign of recognition. They blew the trumpets and shouted, "Jehu is king." And at that moment, the revolution began. Suddenly, Jehu got into his war chariot and rode toward Jezreel like a whirlwind. First, Jehu went to Naboth's field, that same land that Jezebel had stolen to give to her husband Ahab after assassinating the righteous man. There was Joram, the second son of Ahab, now king of Israel, along with King Ahaziah of Judah. Jehu raised his bow and, without hesitation, shot an arrow that pierced Joram's heart and said, "Here in the inheritance of Naboth, the Lord gives you your payment." The king's body fell in the same place where Naboth had been killed. Ahaziah tried to flee, but he didn't get far. He was wounded by Jehu's men and fell in Megiddo. The prophecy was fulfilled word for word. But justice was not yet complete. She was missing. Jezebel. The queen was in her palace in Jezreel, and knowing that Jehu was coming, she prepared herself, painted her eyes, fixed her hair, and watched from the window as Jehu appeared on the horizon. "Is it peace? You Zimri, murderer of your master," she shouted in mockery from the palace window. Jehu looked up and shouted to the people, "Who is with me?" 2 or 3 officials looked out, and Jehu ordered them, "Throw her down." And so they pushed her out the window. Jezebel's body fell from a height and crashed against the ground. Her blood splattered the walls, and the horses trampled her without mercy. Later, Jehu ordered her to be buried, but when they went to look for her body, they could not find it. Only some remains of her feet and the palms of her hands. The dogs had devoured her, just as Elijah had prophesied. And so the word of the Lord was fulfilled. The house of Ahab was completely destroyed. His sons, his allies, his priests, all fell by the sword of Jehu, and the judgment was fulfilled. But Jehu did not stop there. One by one, all the sons of Ahab were executed. The 70 descendants were beheaded. Then came the servants, the ministers, the false prophets, and all those associated with the throne of Samaria. In a single campaign, Jehu completely eradicated the house of Ahab. Every word of the divine judgment was fulfilled. The blood of the prophets was avenged, and the legacy of Elijah, even after having ascended to heaven, continued to burn like fire on earth, because although Elijah's body no longer walked on the earth, his spirit had not disappeared. And centuries later, a new prophecy arose from the mouth of a last prophet before the great silence. The prophet Malachi, "Behold, I will send you Elijah the prophet before the great and terrible day of the Lord comes. He will turn the hearts of the fathers to the children and the hearts of the children to their fathers, lest I come one and strike the land with a curse." He was not talking about the Elijah of the past, but about an Elijah to come, about a prophetic spirit that would return to awaken dormant hearts, to call for truth in the midst of lukewarmness, to prepare the way for judgment and for restoration. It was an announcement before the end, Elijah would return. Before the terrible and glorious day of the Lord, a voice like his, a call like his, would be heard once more. It was not just a promise, it was a warning. That means that the story of Elijah, the prophet who never died, has not yet ended. Because, according to the scriptures, he will return once more. And when he does, the world must be ready. From Elijah, we learn that God also accompanies and sustains us when we are broken. We learn that even the bravest fall, that the most faithful servants also have fear, and that even prophets can feel lonely, empty, and on the verge of collapse. And this story now calls out to you. Yes, to you who may have walked with doubts, with fears, with moments of deep spiritual fatigue, who have felt that the struggle is too much, that you are alone, that the world around you has forgotten God. To you who, like Elijah, have wanted to hide under a broom tree, wishing to give up. Listen to this. God is not finished with you. He did not turn away from Elijah when he no longer had strength, nor did he rebuke him when he fell down. He fed him, he touched him, and he strengthened him, and then he spoke to him again. Perhaps you too are at that point, tired and wounded inside. Today, God is calling you. Because if we learn anything from Elijah, it is that God does not use the perfect. He uses the available, those who want to listen to him with faith. And if you know someone who needs to hear this message, someone who is going through doubts or feeling alone, share it. This video could be just what they need. Support this video with a like and subscribe so you don't miss the next transformative stories from the Bible. Blessings to you and your family.